Have you ever heard of the 7 Gates of Hell? It's a paranormal hotspot nestled in rural Pennsylvania, shrouded in eerie legends and chilling tales. Growing up just 15 miles away, I always thought it was just some local lore. Turns out, it's a nationwide phenomenon. People travel hundreds of miles just to see it. Now, I've never been one to believe in the paranormal. Ghosts, demons, spirits, none of it ever felt real to me. If I couldn't see it, hear it, or touch it, it didn't exist in my logical, fact-based world. My friends, though, they were obsessed. We were sophomores in high school, and their evenings revolved around ghost hunting adventures. From summoning spirits with pendulums behind Maddie's house to messing with Ouija boards, they tried it all. Did any of it work? Of course not. Pendulums swung because of the wind, and Ouija boards moved because someone wanted them to. I always played along but never really believed. So when Kenny suggested we visit the 7 Gates of Hell, I shrugged. Why not? At least it was steeped in history. The legend goes like this: back in the early 1800s, there was an asylum deep in the woods of Helm Township. It was the kind of place where the treatment was often worse than the illness. One night, the asylum caught fire. Isolated in the forest, the fire brigade couldn't reach it in time. Most of the inmates burned alive, and those who escaped perished in the woods, either from starvation, smoke inhalation, or wild animals. The ruins, they say, are hidden beyond the 6th gate. That Friday night, we set out. Kenny, Maddie, Andrew, Lauren, and I crammed into Kenny's pickup, leaving town at 10 p.m. The plan was to reach the ruins by 3 a.m., the witching hour. So, what are you guys hoping to find out there? I asked, glancing around. Kenny grinned. The usual. Ghosts, demons, maybe the devil himself if he's feeling sociable. Maddie and Lauren seemed unusually quiet. Normally, they were the loudest ones on these adventures, but tonight, they looked uneasy. Depends how far we get, Lauren finally said. I heard Anders and Lawrence made it to the 3rd gate before they turned back. They said they heard voices. Saw eyes in the woods. I smirked. Anders and Lawrence were the class clowns, hardly reliable sources for a ghost story. But Lauren's voice had a nervous edge that made me glance at Maddie. She was pale, her eyes scanning the dark forest beyond the truck window. I wrapped an arm around her, trying to reassure her, or maybe myself. After a 45-minute drive, we pulled up to a broken street sign, Toad Road. This was it, the infamous starting point of our journey into the unknown. Kenny killed the engine, and the silence was deafening. "All right," he said, grabbing a flashlight. "Everybody got their lights and knives?" Knives. Right. Kenny had insisted we bring them, for protection, he said. Against what? Coyotes, probably. Ghosts? Less likely. We all nodded and followed him into the woods. About 1/8 of a mile in, we should hit the 1st gate, Kenny said, his voice low. Once we cross that, we're officially in the devil's territory. He smirked, but no one laughed. As we moved deeper into the forest, the darkness pressed in around us, heavy and suffocating. Somewhere behind me, Maddie whispered, "Do you hear that?" I froze. The forest was alive with sounds, branches snapping, leaves rustling, but this was different. It was faint, almost imperceptible. A voice? A whisper? I leaned close to Maddie and whispered, "It's going to be fine. Maybe we'll finally find something real, and this whole paranormal obsession can die already." She gave me a weak smile, but her nervous glances toward the woods told a different story. Kenny was already ahead, leading us into the dense forest. It wasn't long, maybe 5 minutes, before we reached the 1st gate. It stood there, rusting and overgrown with vines, in the middle of nowhere. To me, it was just scrap metal, but the others looked at it like it was the gateway to another world. Their mix of excitement and anxiety made the air feel heavier than it should have. "So, what's supposed to happen when we cross?" I asked, bracing for Kenny's usual theatrics. The first gate isn't much, Kenny replied, his flashlight beam catching flecks of rust on the bars. Since we're still far from the asylum, the spirits here are weaker. You might feel some pressure, maybe like someone shoving you, but that's about it. Oh, and electronics? They don't work in the gates. Phones, flashlights, everything goes haywire. So stick close. If you get separated, go back to the car. I left it unlocked. We don't need anyone getting lost out here. With a dramatic flourish, Kenny tapped the gate twice with his flashlight, sending a spray of rust into the air. Then, grinning like a performer on stage, he stepped through to the other side. I followed, Maddie close behind me. One by one, the rest of the group crossed over. Unsurprisingly, I felt nothing unusual. No pressure. No whispers. Just the same eerie quiet that had settled over the woods. Then I pulled out my phone. It was dead. Strange, since it had been at 80% when we left the car. Hey, are your phones off too? I asked. One by one, everyone checked. Every phone was dead. I told myself it was probably just bad reception or cheap batteries, but the way Maddie shifted closer to me said she wasn't buying that explanation. Guys, I don't know about this, she whispered. It feels too real. Stop freaking yourself out, I said, squeezing her shoulder. Worst case? We all die in some kind of poltergeist extravaganza. Kenny laughed at that, but Maddie didn't look amused. The second gate was about a mile deeper into the woods. Kenny led the way, his flashlight casting long, jittery shadows. So, Kenny, what's supposed to, I started, but his words cut me off. Hold up, he said, his voice tight. He stopped and rolled up his jeans, revealing a fresh gash along the back of his leg. Blood oozed from the cut, staining his sock. What the hell happened? I asked, shining my flashlight around. Nothing. No thorn bushes, no low branches. Nothing that could have caused a wound like that. I don't know, Kenny muttered. I didn't feel anything until now. I was about to respond when I felt it, a light tap on my shoulder. I spun around, expecting Maddie or Lauren, but no one was there. Everyone else was standing in front of me, staring at Kenny's leg. Okay, yeah. That's weird, I admitted. We pressed on, Kenny limping slightly but insisting he was fine. Maddie stayed close to me, whispering about how it felt like someone was pushing her, leaning into her with invisible weight. I told her it was just nerves, her mind playing tricks, but deep down, her unease was starting to seep into me. The second gate loomed ahead, twisted and rusted like the first, but with an air of menace that wasn't there before. Alright, here we go, Kenny said, trying to sound cheerful. Past this one, you might feel like you're being followed. Oh, and maybe some cult members hanging around the third gate. No big deal. We laughed nervously, but no one believed it was a joke. Halfway through the second gate, Maddie's flashlight flickered and went out. Damn it, she hissed. Fresh batteries and everything. She moved closer to me, clutching my arm as I held my light steady for the both of us. Then we heard it. A scream. Sharp and piercing, it echoed through the trees, chilling me to my core. I whipped around and saw Lauren on the ground, her flashlight rolling away in the dirt. Her eyes were wide, wild, and terrified. Lauren! I shouted, rushing to her side. But as I reached her, the shadows around us seemed to deepen, pressing in closer. And that's when I felt it. Something was watching us. Lauren sat in the dirt, shaking, her breath ragged. When she finally looked up, her head turned so fast I thought she might hurt herself. It felt like someone tackled me, she stammered, her voice trembling. I didn't just fall. I swear, something hit me. Her eyes darted to each of us, searching for some kind of validation. I offered her a hand, but she shook her head and pushed herself to her feet. The look on her face was enough to send chills down my spine, fear mixed with something else. Confusion? Helplessness? I couldn't quite place it. Kenny rolled his eyes, clearly unimpressed. Maddie, on the other hand, looked like she was on the verge of tears. "Let's just keep moving," Kenny muttered, waving his flashlight in the direction of the third gate. As we walked, the sensation of being watched grew stronger. At first, I tried to brush it off, chalking it up to paranoia or the power of suggestion. But the longer it went on, the more intense it became. My eyes scanned the darkness, looking for any sign of wildlife, a coyote, a raccoon, anything, but the forest was unnervingly still. No rustling leaves, no chirping crickets. Nothing. "Guys," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Stop for a second. Just listen." Everyone froze. The silence was deafening. No wind. No distant howls. Not even the faint buzz of insects. The pit in my stomach grew heavier, like a lead weight pulling me down. "That's not normal," I said, breaking the silence. "Something's wrong. We should turn back." Lauren nodded quickly, her face pale. "I agree. I don't want to mess with this anymore." I felt something, someone, shove me back there. This isn't right." "I'm down to turn back," Andrea added, his voice calm but his eyes betraying his unease. "Are you all serious?" Kenny snapped, throwing his hands in the air. "We came all this way, and now you want to chicken out? Come on. We're so close." As he spoke, I felt it again, a tap on my shoulder. My skin crawled. I turned my head, already knowing I wouldn't see anything. And, of course, I didn't. "How much further to the third gate?" I asked, trying to keep the edge out of my voice. "It should be just ahead," Kenny said, marching forward without waiting for a response. Reluctantly, we followed. After a few minutes, the forest opened up, revealing a road that seemed to appear out of nowhere. The asphalt was bare, no markings, no signs of wear. Just a strip of concrete cutting through the wilderness. At the end of the road, barely visible in the dim light, stood another gate. Unlike the others, this one looked newer, sturdier, and out of place in the otherwise desolate surroundings. As we approached, Maddie let out a choked sob. "What's wrong?" I asked, my voice trembling despite my efforts to stay calm. She didn't answer. She couldn't. Her face was frozen in terror, her arm outstretched, pointing toward the side of the road. My eyes followed her gesture, and I saw them. Eyes. Bright green, glowing faintly in the darkness. Dozens of them. No, hundreds. They stared at us from the shadows, unblinking, their eerie luminescence sending my heart into overdrive. One by one, the others noticed. Lauren let out a shriek that echoed into the silence, her hands clutching at her mouth. Andrea stood frozen, his face blank with shock. Maddie buried her face into my chest, sobbing uncontrollably. Kenny smiled. For a brief moment, his face lit up with an almost childlike glee, as if he were thrilled to finally have proof of something supernatural. But his smile didn't last. It twisted into a grimace as the eyes began to move. Figures stepped out of the shadows, emerging into the dim light of the road. Men, or something that resembled men. Their faces were shrouded in darkness, but their movements were deliberate, coordinated. Each carried a weapon, a rusted machete, a jagged piece of metal, a wooden club, and their presence was suffocating. I couldn't breathe. My heart pounded against my ribcage as Maddie clung to me, trembling. Andrea's expression was distant, his mind seemingly unable to process what was happening. Lauren stood motionless, silent tears streaming down her face. What do we do?" I whispered, though I already knew the answer. No one replied. We were trapped. Kenny's confidence had always bordered on recklessness, but this time it felt like he'd stepped too far past the line. His bravado was unsettling, almost alien, as he stood there defiantly, staring at the figures as if daring them to act. "No, we're going to keep going. This is public land," Kenny said, his voice unwavering. "You can't stop us. I don't believe you'll pull that trigger." The silence that followed was unbearable. My hand instinctively reached for Kenny's shoulder, a desperate attempt to pull him back. "Kenny," I whispered, my voice shaking. "We need to go. These guys aren't messing around." The figures didn't move, their glowing eyes locked on Kenny. The one holding the shotgun raised it slowly. The subtle static sounds surrounding them grew louder, almost deafening. A sudden crack shattered the air. I didn't even have time to scream. Kenny was gone. Not dead. Not injured. Just gone. One moment, my hand was on his shoulder, and the next, it was grasping at empty space. The figures disappeared with him, leaving no trace, not a sound, not a shadow, not even the static hum. It was as if they'd never been there at all. "Kenny!" I screamed, my voice echoing into the void. I turned to the others, their faces pale and frozen in horror. "Where is he, Daniel?" Andrew yelled, his voice cracking with desperation. He grabbed me by the shirt, shaking me. "You had your hand on him. Where is he?" I don't know." My voice trembled, the words feeling hollow even as I spoke them. Andrew shoved me, hard enough that I stumbled backward. "People don't just disappear," he shouted, but his anger quickly dissolved into fear. He dropped to his knees where Kenny had stood moments before, his hands trembling as they hovered over the empty space. "We have to leave," he muttered, his voice barely audible. "We have to tell someone. The police. Somebody." "No." The word cut through the tension like a blade. Lauren stood tall, her face set in an expression of determination I hadn't seen before. The fear that had consumed her earlier was replaced by something colder, sharper. "If we leave now," she said, her voice steady, "Kenny might as well be dead. He might already be, but if we keep going, maybe we can find those things again. Maybe we can make a deal." Her words sent a chill down my spine. The idea of facing those creatures again was unthinkable, but the alternative, leaving Kenny behind, lost forever, was worse. "I don't want to," Maddie whimpered, her voice breaking as tears streamed down her face. "I just want to go home." I didn't blame her. Every part of me wanted to turn back, to run as far as I could and never look back. But Kenny needed us, or at least, I had to believe he did. "I'm sorry, Maddie," I said, my voice wavering. "I know you're scared. We all are. But we can't leave him. Not like this." She sniffled, trying to stifle her sobs. I can't. I placed a hand on her shoulder, my own fear barely contained. "We have to. For Kenny. For ourselves. We have to." The words felt hollow, repeated as much for my benefit as for hers. Deep down, I wasn't sure if I believed them. But there was no turning back now. The road ahead loomed, dark and silent, promising nothing but more terror. And yet, step by step, we moved forward, our flashlights barely piercing the oppressive darkness. Somewhere, in the distance, the static hum began to return. Maddie looked at me, her eyes wide with fear, like a child anticipating punishment. Tears streamed down her face as she nodded, a quiet acceptance of what lay ahead. With a deep, shuddering breath, she pulled herself to her feet. I didn't give myself any more time to think. If I stopped now, I might lose my nerve entirely. I walked up to the third gate, placing my hand on the cold, rusted metal. With a steadying breath, I stepped around it. The others followed, hesitant but silent. The trail beyond the third gate was different. The path we had been following was gone, replaced by uneven ground and dense thickets that seemed to close in on us. It was as if the forest had shifted, rearranging itself to keep us trapped. Strangely, I knew exactly where to go. It wasn't instinct, it felt more like I was being guided by an unseen force. I turned around certain trees, crossed a narrow stream when it would have been easier to follow the bank, and pressed forward without hesitation. The sensation on my shoulder, the persistent tapping that had been growing stronger, was almost unbearable now. Each tap felt like a small, sharp jolt, urging me onward. I wasn't the only one feeling it. Maddie, Andrew, and Lauren all grimaced occasionally, their movements jerking as if responding to invisible prods. But no one spoke of it. We trudged on in silence, each step heavier than the last. Then, a scream. It came from somewhere ahead, distant but chillingly clear. The sound cut through the stillness like a blade, freezing us in place. For a moment, none of us moved. Then Andrew and Lauren broke into a sprint, calling out for whoever had screamed. Maddie and I followed close behind, the fear in her eyes mirrored in my own. We burst into a clearing, nearly colliding with Andrew and Lauren, who had stopped dead in their tracks. "What is it?" I asked, my voice shaking. They didn't answer. Instead, Andrew pointed wordlessly ahead. My eyes followed his trembling hand, and I felt my stomach drop. In the center of the clearing stood a creature, no, a nightmare. Its form was a twisted parody of a human, tall and impossibly thin, with 4 elongated arms ending in curved, blade-like appendages. Its skin was a void, a black so deep it seemed to absorb the light from our flashlights. And it wasn't alone. At its feet lay my mother. She writhed in pain, blood pouring from wounds inflicted by the creature's razor-sharp limbs. "Mom!" I screamed, my voice raw with desperation. I ran toward her, ignoring the shouts of my friends behind me. Just as I reached out to tackle the creature, it vanished. Gone. I stumbled forward, my hands hitting the ground where it had stood. My mother was gone too. In her place was an old man, his face twisted into a grotesque smile, blood dripping from his lips. He stared at me, licking his lips slowly, before he too disappeared. I collapsed to my knees, my mind racing. Nothing made sense. Was it a hallucination? A trick? The others remained silent, their faces pale and drawn. They had seen it too. Whatever this was, it wasn't just in my head. What are we even doing? Andrew muttered, his voice hollow. If we find Kenny, if we even find him, what are we supposed to do? Lauren's face hardened. Her usual softness was replaced with a steely determination. "We're going to kill whoever, whatever, took him," she said, her voice devoid of emotion. The shift in her demeanor was unsettling. The girl who once giggled over makeup tutorials and harmless flirtations now looked like a soldier marching to war. We pressed on, the oppressive silence broken only by the crunch of leaves underfoot. It wasn't long before we reached the 4th gate, if you could call it that. It wasn't a physical structure. Instead, a line had been drawn in the dirt, jagged and uneven, as though carved by a giant, unseen hand. The air beyond the line felt different, colder, heavier, charged with an energy that made my skin crawl. I stepped over the line without hesitation, and the temperature seemed to drop instantly. The faint sounds of the forest were replaced by distant, mournful wails that echoed through the trees. Maddie hesitated, her face pale and drawn. When she finally stepped over, she froze, her breath hitching in her throat. She turned to me, her expression pleading, but I could only offer her a weak smile. "Are we going to talk about how we even got here?" Andrew asked, his voice sharp with unease. "We had no directions, no map, and yet we've made it to the 4th gate. How is that possible?" I didn't have an answer. None of us did. We were being guided, of that much, I was certain. The only question was, by what? And for what purpose? Andrew was fuming now, his frustration bubbling over into a rant. How do we even know this was supposed to be the gate? There were so many turns, so many routes. This thing's barely 6 feet long. And yet we all just knew, what is that about? His voice cracked, anger masking the fear we all shared. It wasn't the first time I'd seen Andrew lose it, but this was different. It wasn't about a botched football game or some petty schoolyard spat. This was about the ghost, or whatever it was, that had taken Kenny. "I don't know, Andrew," I replied, my voice steadier than I felt. "I don't have answers. But standing here arguing isn't going to help. Let's just keep moving." Andrew crossed his arms, shivering as the cold bit deeper, but he fell into step, trudging ahead. Lauren stayed beside him, her eyes darting nervously to the trees. I focused on the path ahead, or what little there was of it, trying to shut out the growing sense of dread. The deeper we ventured into the fourth gate's domain, the more oppressive the forest became. The screams we'd heard before were no longer distant, they seemed to weave through the trees, bouncing off the trunks, taunting us. Despite the chill, sweat trickled down my back. My heart pounded as we walked, but I couldn't shake the sense that this was all futile. Even if we found Kenny, or Emma, what would we do? What could we do? Then the visions began. They came in brief flashes, like fragmented dreams. At first, they were merely disorienting, ash falling like snow, creatures crawling across the ground, their bulbous eyes glowing with malice. But soon, they grew more vivid, more terrifying. I saw a sky ablaze with fire, wings of flame beating as something hurtled downward. I wanted them to stop, but they wouldn't. The images burned themselves into my mind, growing more persistent with every step. I was pulled from one such vision, a fiery descent that ended in a bone-crushing impact, by a scream. Maddie. I turned, my heart leaping into my throat, and saw the empty space where she had been walking moments before. There was no flash of light, no sudden disappearance like Kenny or Emma. This time, there was blood. A trail of it. Please, help, Maddie's voice was faint, coming from somewhere ahead. I followed the sound, my flashlight trembling in my hand. Then I saw her. She was impaled on a thick, gnarled branch, her body limp and blood pooling beneath her. The branch jutted grotesquely from her stomach, its jagged bark slick with crimson. Her eyes fluttered open, locking onto mine with a look of pure terror. Maddie, hold on! I shouted, my voice cracking. Lauren sprang into action, climbing a nearby tree with a speed and grace that startled me. I had forgotten she used to be a climber, but now it was a lifeline. I've got you, Maddie, Lauren whispered, her voice calm but strained as she worked her way across a precarious crossing point between the trees. Maddie's head lolled to the side, her movements sluggish, as if the life was already draining from her. When Lauren reached her, she cradled Maddie's face, whispering reassurances. Then, with no other option, she broke the branches close to Maddie's body as she could and began to pull her free. But before she could finish, Maddie's body vanished. Gone. Lauren froze, her hands still clutching where Maddie had been. Then, slowly, she climbed down, her face pale and drawn. She's gone, she whispered, her voice hollow. I collapsed to my knees, the weight of it all crashing down. Maddie was gone. Not like Kenny, where there was still some faint, desperate hope of finding him alive, but truly gone. The light had left her eyes, and now even her body was missing. The image of her impaled on that tree would haunt me forever. Her bloodied face, the way she had begged us to leave, and how we had forced her to keep going, all of it replayed in my mind like a cruel loop. But there was no time to grieve. The forest didn't care about our pain. The screams continued, closer now, echoing around us like a haunting chorus. Whatever resided here, whatever malevolent force had taken our friends, it wasn't finished with us yet. And deep down, I knew, it wouldn't stop until it had claimed us all. I only had a fleeting moment of clarity before the visions returned, dragging me into a twisted realm of horrors. My home crumbled, swallowed by an earthquake, while creatures beyond description clawed and screeched at me from the shadows. Their presence was suffocating, like a weight pressing against my chest, and I could feel someone, physically shoving me forward, their hands gripping under my arms. It wasn't just me. Lauren climbed down from her futile attempt to save Maddie, her face blank and devoid of emotion. Without a word, she walked past me, heading in the direction I'd been pushed. Andrew followed her, his head hung low, leaving me as the last to move. I cast one final glance behind us, at the place where Maddie had been, and forced myself to follow. The fifth gate didn't exist in the way the others had. There was no tangible marker, no ominous structure. Yet we all felt it as we passed. Lauren broke the silence that had gripped us since Maddie's death. We just passed the fifth gate, she said, her voice hollow. A dull ache settled over me. The hands that had pushed me earlier were gone, replaced by a relentless, crushing pressure, like being trapped in the iron grip of a giant. The visions worsened, becoming a constant torment, but I was too numb to care. They were just part of me now, like a scar etched into my soul. The terrain shifted as we walked. The trees were skeletal, their bark darkened and brittle. Thickets of thorns replaced blooming plants, and the air reeked of decay. Dead animals littered the ground, their bodies twisted unnaturally, as if the forest had wrung the life out of them. This was no longer Earth. It couldn't be. If a place like this existed in the real world, someone would have noticed. Someone would have stopped it. And then we saw the eyes. They glowed an eerie green, watching us from every direction. The forest, as lifeless as it was, seemed to pulse with malevolence, pressing down on us like a suffocating fog. I glanced at Andrew, who darted his head around, searching for a way out, while Lauren stared straight ahead, unflinching. "You have one last chance," the voice from the third gate returned, booming through the air like a storm. None of us responded. The dark figures emerged, no longer cloaked but fully visible. Their grotesque forms sent shivers down my spine. Limbs too long, torsos unnaturally thick, and skin pulled taut over their frames, as if they'd been stretched to breaking point. They looked like demons conjured from a sacrificial ritual, their weapons gleaming in the faint light. This time, they didn't hesitate. They charged at us from all sides, a deafening roar of white noise accompanying their advance. Without thinking, I sprinted forward, adrenaline surging through my veins. "We need to find a way through," I yelled, though my voice was nearly drowned out by the creature's unholy noise. Lauren shouted something back, her words fragmented by the cacophony. I caught enough to understand her plan. She wanted us to split up. Each of us would run in a different direction, hoping to distract the creatures and give the others a chance to escape. "No!" I screamed. "We stick together. No one else is dying." But Lauren didn't listen. She veered left, her determination unshaken. Andrew hesitated for a moment before following her lead, cutting sharply to the right. I stayed my course, refusing to abandon either of them. The creatures were relentless, their grotesque forms closing in on us. One swung a massive club at me, its jagged spikes glinting menacingly. I barely managed to dodge, throwing myself to the left. The motion sent me stumbling, but I caught myself and kept running. My lungs burned, and my legs felt like lead, but I couldn't stop. The memory of Maddie's lifeless body and Kenny's defiant stare pushed me forward. I couldn't let their sacrifices be in vain. But the creatures were faster. Stronger. No matter how hard I ran, their guttural growls grew louder, their shadows looming over me. A part of me wanted to give up. To let them take me and end this nightmare once and for all. But then I thought of Maddie's final moments. The desperate plea in her eyes. And Kenny's unwavering resolve as he faced the unknown. No. I wasn't giving up. Not yet. Andrew's sacrifice left me reeling. His final, desperate act to distract the creatures was horrifyingly selfless, but there was no time to mourn. The demons tore into him with unrestrained ferocity, and I forced myself to look away, the sound of ripping flesh and bones echoing behind me. I ran, tears stinging my eyes as I caught up with Lauren. Her expression was cold, devoid of any emotion, as though the Andrew we both knew had already been dead to her. "How do we do this, Lauren?" I gasped, my breath ragged, my body on the brink of collapse. "We're already dead, Daniel," she replied flatly. "Don't you get that?" It wasn't a question. There was no grief for Andrew, no regret for Maddie, no hope for herself. She turned and marched forward, resolute, leaving me to stumble after her. The sixth gate loomed ahead, its presence oppressive yet intangible. We didn't speak. What was there to say? The forest screamed with the wails of the damned, the air thick with despair. I could feel my sanity slipping away with each step. My vision blurred. The grotesque images overtaking my mind were no longer separate from reality. My arms were a patchwork of wounds, the flesh torn and bruised, yet I felt no pain. I laughed bitterly to myself. If death came now, at least it would be merciful. We walked for hours, aimlessly wandering through the abyss. The guiding presence that had pushed us through the earlier gates was gone, leaving us lost in a hellscape of dying trees and endless shadows. The forest seemed to mock us, its labyrinthine paths ensuring there was no escape. Then the voice returned. "Only one can go." The words echoed in my mind, cold and final. I turned to Lauren, and I knew she had heard it too. Her head snapped around, her eyes blazing with a fury I hadn't seen before. "Lauren, wait." I barely had time to react before her fist collided with my jaw, sending me sprawling to the ground. "What are you doing?" I shouted, scrambling to my feet, but she was relentless. Another blow landed, this time on my temple, and my vision went dark for a moment. I collapsed, clutching my head as her voice rang out above me. "The forest has rules, Daniel. You play by them, or you die. Haven't you learned that yet?" she screamed. A kick to my ribs made me cry out, the pain sharp and unyielding. Another kick followed, and then another. I curled into myself, begging her to stop, but she didn't. Finally, she knelt over me, her thumbs pressing against my eyes. "You were always weak, Daniel," she hissed, her voice dripping with contempt. The pressure on my eyes grew unbearable, the pain blinding and excruciating. I thrashed beneath her, my body acting on instinct. With a desperate roll, I threw her off balance and shoved her away, gasping for air and clutching my head. "Lauren, stop. Please!" I begged, but her face was a mask of rage and determination. "There's no other way," she screamed, lunging at me again. Her arms wrapped around my neck, not to choke me but to restrain me. I shoved her off once more, panic and despair fueling my strength. "Think, Daniel, think," I muttered to myself, trying to find a solution, a way out that didn't involve this madness. But Lauren wouldn't stop. She kept coming, her attacks growing more frenzied, her resolve unshakable. Each time I pushed her away, she returned, relentless in her pursuit of survival at any cost. I was running out of options, and I knew it. The forest had made its rule clear. Only one could go. I could see the exhaustion in Lauren's movements. Her attacks were growing weaker, her resolve fading. When she lunged at me again, I sidestepped, grabbing her mid-motion and throwing her off. This time, she didn't get back up. Panting, I stumbled toward her, my hands still rubbing my eyes, trying to clear the lingering pain. When I reached her, she turned her head to face me. The fury in her gaze had vanished, replaced by the familiar warmth of the person I used to know. "Daniel, what's happening?" "I can't feel my legs," she whispered, her voice trembling. My heart sank as I looked down and saw the gruesome truth. When I had thrown her, she had landed on a jagged rock. Blood pooled around the base of her neck, where bone protruded through torn skin. I had broken her neck. "It's going to be okay, Lauren." "I'm here," I lied, holding her trembling body in my arms. She clung to me, her ocean blue eyes filled with fear and pain. "We were supposed to make it, Daniel," she said softly. "I know," I replied, my voice breaking. She exhaled one last shuddering breath before her body went still. Then, like the others, she vanished into thin air, leaving me utterly alone. I stayed kneeling for a moment, staring at the empty space where she had been. When I finally stood and looked up, the seventh gate was directly in front of me. It was unlike anything I had imagined, a grand, Gothic structure, reminiscent of a Victorian mansion, its architecture flawless and pristine. Behind it loomed the infamous asylum, its exterior untouched by fire or decay, as if it had been constructed yesterday. I hesitated. For all the horrors I had faced, this sight seemed almost serene, but I knew better. My instincts screamed that this was the heart of the nightmare. As I approached, the gate swung open effortlessly, inviting me in. I stepped through, and everything changed. The oppressive noises, the pressure, the haunting visions, they all vanished. It felt normal again. For the first time in hours, I could breathe. My injuries remained, but they felt distant, like someone else's pain. I reached the front door of the asylum and placed a trembling hand on the handle. With a deep breath, I pushed it open. Inside stood Kenny, Maddie, Lauren, and Andrew. My heart surged with hope and relief, but it quickly froze in my chest. They were battered and bloodied, their faces streaked with tears. I tried to run to them, but an invisible barrier stopped me. Kenny, Maddie, Lauren, Andrew, I screamed, pounding against the unseen wall. From the shadows, one of the dark figures emerged, its grotesque form illuminated by the dim light. It raised a jagged blade and slashed across Kenny's chest. His scream was deafening, a mix of agony and desperation. "Help us," he cried, reaching out as he fell to his knees. I screamed back, my fists slamming against the invisible barrier, but it was futile. "Save them all, or save yourself," boomed a voice behind me. I spun around and came face to face with one of the creatures. Its glowing green eyes burned into my soul, its breath hot and fetid. "What do you mean?" I shouted, my voice trembling. "Save them all, or save yourself," it repeated, unflinching. The weight of its words crushed me. My friends were beyond saving, yet the asylum offered me a chance to end this nightmare. I turned back to the scene inside, their cries and anguish tearing at my heart. I wanted to save them, but I knew it wasn't possible. Not now. The creature gestured toward the door, as if urging me to choose. I scribbled a note on a scrap of paper the creature provided, my hands shaking. My last message to the world. Don't attempt the 7 gates of hell. It isn't worth it. Daniel Huntington. Months later, Lauren Lopez read the note aloud to her friends. "I don't know anyone named Daniel Huntington," she said, frowning. "But this, it feels familiar somehow. Like a dream I can't remember." Her friends exchanged nervous glances, dismissing it as a prank. Kenny grinned, trying to lighten the mood. "Sounds like a perfect adventure for tonight," he said, smirking. And so, despite the warning, the 4 of them prepared for their journey. None of them would return.